Is the resurrection fact or faith? If Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain and your faith is in vain. This quote from the Apostle Paul demonstrates how the resurrection of Jesus is a pivotal aspect of Christianity. Without it, Christianity has no grounds for credibility. This is because if Jesus wasn't raised from the dead, then he wasn't the Messiah who they thought was to die for the sins of the world, and Christians today would be believing in a lie. But if he did indeed rise from the dead, then Christians have good reason for their faith. Consequently, if there is reliable evidence for the resurrection, then it should no longer be considered a mere faith of Christians, but a historical fact. The resurrection should be viewed as a historical event because of the death of Jesus, the appearance of Jesus after his death, and Jesus' followers going to their deaths for believing in the resurrection. First, the New Testament is an abundant source of first century documents and is filled with early independent sources that attest to the death of Jesus. These documents are significant because they can establish that Jesus was a real historical figure that would eventually die. The most detailed sources of the death of Jesus come from the Gospels Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These Gospels are biographies of Jesus that date from the mid to late first century. According to Mark, which is the earliest Gospel, Jesus was crucified under the ruling of Pontius Pilate, and this crucifixion would eventually lead to his death. What is also significant about this is the fact that in all four Gospels, Pontius Pilate is portrayed as being reluctant of wanting to crucify Jesus and didn't find any guilt in him, but the Jews ultimately pushed for Jesus to be killed. Now, this is significant because the Gospel writers were first century Jews or were based on the eyewitness accounts of first century Jews, and Roman leadership was looked at as the enemy. So if they were making this up, it is unlikely that they would make a well-known Roman figure look like the good guy in the story. Given that, this gives good credibility for this being a real event in history. Not only does Mark attest to these details about Jesus' death, but also every other gospel attests to Jesus dying under the ruling of Pontius Pilate. Given that these Gospels are four early independent sources, all agreeing about the same details surrounding the death of Jesus, this gives good grounds for establishing that this as a historical fact. However, the Gospels of the New Testament aren't the only early documents that mention the death of Jesus. There is a popular non-Christian source, which is the Roman historian Tacitus, who mentions in the Annals of Tacitus, written around 116 AD, the death of a figure called the Christ, who was the one responsible for the Christian movement in the Roman Empire. Tacitus would also say that when this Christ died, it was during the reign of Tiberius Caesar, and his death was authorized by Pontius Pilate. Although Tacitus doesn't call this Christ Jesus of Nazareth, it is assumed that he is referring to Jesus. This is significant because this was a Roman historian with no Christian bias reporting the death of Jesus as if it was a real event that was carried out by Pontius Pilate. The fact that this non-biased record exists shows that the death of Jesus was an actual event in history and more than just something Christians believed. What is also significant is that it agrees exactly with what the Gospels claimed about the death of Jesus having been killed under the charge of Pontius Pilate. Without a non-biased source like this, it would be very easy for early Christians to make up the life and death of Jesus. But with this, the historical credibility increases significantly. Given that there are a variety of sources that attest to the death of Jesus, it can be established that, at the very least, Jesus' death is a historical certainty. Secondly, not only are there early independent sources in the New Testament that mention the life and death of Jesus, but they also speak of him appearing alive to many of his followers and others after his death. 3 of the 4 Gospels give a detailed account of a resurrected Jesus appearing bodily to his closest followers. For example, in Luke's Gospel, it describes Jesus appearing to his disciples after his death from the crucifixion with scars of his crucifixion still present. And he even encouraged them to touch him to prove that he wasn't a spirit, but a fleshly body. Jesus would also eat a piece of fish in their presence as well. The fact that he ate with them and encouraged them to touch him were significant details because the appearance wasn't just a spiritual experience, but something that was physical and real. Given that, Luke wanted to make it very clear that Jesus, who had been dead, appeared to his followers alive again and bodily present. This is significant because his followers were fully aware that once he appeared to them, it meant that he was indeed raised from the dead. It can be established from these gospel accounts that Jesus appeared to his disciples alive after his death. Even though the Gospels are the most detailed early accounts of the appearances of Jesus, they aren't the earliest documentations of the appearances of Jesus in the New Testament. The earliest source is most likely from the Apostle Paul in his first letter to the Corinthians, which most scholars date this letter to around 50 AD, which would be the which would be close to 20 years after the death of Jesus. In this letter, Paul states how he received what is believed to be an early church creed, and the creed states that Jesus appeared not only to his disciples, but also to his brother James, Paul, and over 500 people at one time. What is significant about this creed is that it can be dated to even earlier than 50 AD. Paul mentions that he received this creed, and this creed most likely originated in Jerusalem. And the earliest Paul mentions going to Jerusalem is in his letter to the Galatians, where he states how he visited the Apostle Peter in Jerusalem 3 years after his conversion. Paul's conversion most likely happened within a few years after the death of Jesus, given that this creed could have been given to Paul as early as 37 AD, and it could have originated to a few years after Jesus' death. Having that said, this concept of Jesus appearing to his followers was not something that was developed over time and was reported in the later Gospels, but something that was believed very early after Jesus' death. Lastly, and most importantly, there is documentation that some of the eyewitnesses of Jesus' appearances after the resurrection went to their deaths for their belief in the resurrection, which is significant because if they did claim to see a risen Jesus and then died for this belief, then they were most likely not lying about it. One of the eyewitnesses martyred was Jesus' brother James. In Josephus's 20th book of the Jewish Antiquities, James is described as not only the brother of Jesus, but also being ordered by the high priest Ananias in Jerusalem to be stoned to death for his belief in Jesus. The fact that James died as a martyr is significant because James most likely didn't believe in Jesus during his ministry and was probably a skeptic concerning Jesus. The reason for this is that in Mark's Gospel, when Jesus had attracted a large crowd during his ministry, his family thought he was crazy. Also, in John's Gospel, Jesus' brothers at one point mocked Jesus for not going to a feast in Jerusalem, and they were later described as unbelievers of Jesus. Since James was one of Jesus' brothers, it can be assumed that James was one of the unbelieving brothers that mocked Jesus and thought he was crazy during his ministry. So it seems like James would have been one of the last people to die for believing in his brother's resurrection. But in the book of Acts, James seems to be part of the council in the church in Jerusalem and probably even a leader. The Apostle Paul even referred to James as an apostle. This kind of radical change of behavior could only realistically be explained if he was an eyewitness of the resurrected Jesus. And this is exactly what Paul records in his first letter to the Corinthians, where he lists James as one of the many people who Jesus appeared to after he was raised from the dead. Given that, the only logical conclusion to come to in the case of James was that he was convinced that Jesus did in fact rise from the dead, and he was willing to die for this belief. Another eyewitness to the resurrected Jesus, who was believed to be martyred for his belief in the resurrection, was the Apostle Paul. Christian traditions place Paul's death in around 64 AD, when Nero, the emperor of Rome, was violently persecuting Christians in the Roman Empire. But Paul, like James, was an unlikely candidate for martyrdom due to his opposition to Christianity early on. In the book of Acts, it says that Paul was from modern-day Turkey, so it is likely that Paul never knew Jesus personally or even saw him. But due to Paul being a Pharisee who opposed Jesus as the Messiah, he was active in the persecution of the Jerusalem church for their proclamation of Jesus as the Messiah. However, everything changed when Paul was on the way to persecute the Damascus church, and Paul saw a vision of the risen Jesus that resulted in him proclaiming that Jesus was the Messiah and the Son of God. Given this radical change in behavior, this event must have been an actual appearance of Jesus for Paul to go from a prominent Pharisee who had everything a Jew could ask for and a persecutor of Christians to being a Christian and trying to prove that Jesus was the Messiah. This appearance led to Paul being a major influence in the early church, and we would eventually write half of the New Testament. Consequently, the only logical conclusion to come to in Paul's case is that he did indeed see the risen Jesus. Given that, since Paul and James, who had previously opposed Jesus, went to their deaths to proclaim the resurrection of Jesus, shows that the only plausible explanation for this was that they saw Jesus risen from the dead. Not only were Paul and James martyred, but all of Jesus' disciples were too, who saw him resurrected from the dead. And nobody dies for something they know isn't true. So given all these historical facts, the only explanation that would make sense of all of them is that Jesus did in fact rise from the dead. And if this is the case, then the resurrection should no longer be looked at as a religious faith, but a historical certainty. This would also mean that Christianity has good grounds to justify their beliefs, and their faith is not in vain.